December 1942. Midnight. An ice-cold submarine deck. 10 men sit in their tiny canoes staring into pitch darkness. Ahead of them lies a 70-mile journey, enemy waters, German patrol boats, and finally, Bordeaux Harbor. But let me tell you this, most of these men would never see the sun again, unfortunately. Welcome. Today I'm going to tell you about one of the bravest, craziest, and most tragic operations of World War II, Operation Frankton, or its more popular name, Cockleshell Heroes. I don't know if you've heard this story before, but today you're going to learn it in full detail. If you haven't heard this story before, buckle up, because this is the kind of adventure even Hollywood couldn't invent. This is the story of men who infiltrated a Nazi harbor by kayak, attached mines to ships, then tried to escape by walking hundreds of kilometers through enemy territory. 10 men went in, only 2 came back. And if you enjoy this channel, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and like the video, because you won't want to miss stories like this. If you're ready, let's begin. Now let's step back a bit and look at the big picture. In 1942, Germany controlled most of Europe. France was under occupation. Britain was barely holding on behind the English Channel, enduring German bombardments every single day. But the fate of the war wasn't being decided just on the front lines. It was also being decided on the sea routes. Bordeaux Harbor was a critical logistics hub for Germany. Cargo ships from the Far East docked here. Rubber, vegetable oils, animal fats, and dozens of different raw materials that kept the Nazi war machine running passed through this port. In just 12 months, from June 1941 to 1942, 25,000 tons of raw rubber had reached this harbor. Without rubber, there are no tires. Without tires, no tanks, no trucks, no planes. Moreover, Bordeaux wasn't just home to merchant ships. German U-boats also used this port as a base. Those cursed submarines that hunted British and American convoys in the Atlantic, killing thousands of sailors, were maintained in Bordeaux, refueled, and sent back out to sea. So striking Bordeaux meant cutting one of Germany's vital arteries. This was going to be a crucial operation for Britain. But there was a problem, a big problem. What was it? Bordeaux was inland, about 100 kilometers up the Gironde estuary. The distance from the mouth of the river to the harbor was filled with German patrol boats. 32 Kriegsmarine vessels patrolled these waters. An air raid would cause too many civilian casualties. A naval assault wouldn't work because ships couldn't navigate the shallow waters of the estuary. Reaching Bordeaux through conventional military methods was impossible. This is exactly where one man enters the picture. A Royal Marines officer nicknamed Blondie because of his fair hair, Major Herbert George Hassler. Hassler was born in Dublin in 1914. His father was an army lieutenant, but it was his mother who had the real influence, because young Herbert fell in love with the sea when he was just a child. But this wasn't ordinary affection. At just 10 years old, Hassler built his first canoe with his own hands by reading instructions from the boy's own paper magazine. 10 years old, a child, with wood, canvas, and sheer determination, building his own boat. This detail tells you a lot about Hassler's character. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. Thank you. When he joined the Royal Marines in 1932, his passion for the sea hadn't diminished. That year, he made a solo journey in a small sailboat from Plymouth to Portsmouth and back. This wasn't some amateur adventure. It was dangerous waters, all alone, with nothing but courage and nautical knowledge. In 1940, his bravery during operations in Norway earned him an OBE and the French Croix de Guerre. He was already a proven hero. But Hassler had something else on his mind. Instead of conventional warfare, he envisioned covert operations, Small units, silent attacks, striking from where the enemy least expected. In 1941, he submitted a proposal to the Admiralty, using collapsible canoes and underwater swimmers to attack enemy ships. At first, no one took it seriously. Canoes? In warfare? It sounded like a joke. But the war was changing. During the same period, Italians had begun inflicting serious damage on British ships in the Mediterranean using small craft and manned torpedoes. In December 1941, Italian frogmen sank the battleships HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant in Alexandria Harbor. Two proud warships sent to the bottom by just a few men and a few mines. The message was clear. Small, bold operations worked. It was in this atmosphere that Hasler's ideas resurfaced. On July 6, 1942, a small unit was established at Southsea in Portsmouth, the Royal Marines Boom Patrol Detachment, or RMBPD. Its official name was Boom Patrol, but that was just a cover. The real purpose was entirely different. These men would infiltrate enemy harbors in small canoes and attach limpet mines to ships. Hasler was the unit's commander. His second-in-command was Captain J.D. Stewart, 34 men in total. But Hasler wasn't taking just anyone. He had very specific criteria for volunteers: excellent physical condition, swimming ability, no strong family ties because they might not return, eagerness to attack the enemy, and most importantly, indifference to personal safety. Did that last criterion catch your attention? Indifference to personal safety. In other words, not fearing death. Because everyone knew this could be a suicide mission. Training was intense. The men learned how to handle canoes, night navigation, how to attach limpet mines, and how to work with submarines. Escape and evasion techniques were also part of the curriculum, in case they were captured. The canoes were the Cockleshell Mark II, approximately 4.5 meters long, two-person collapsible craft. Plywood bottoms, canvas sides, compact enough to fit in a submarine's tight spaces, yet sturdy enough to carry 2 men and their equipment. Each canoe carried 2 men, 8 limpet mines, paddles, a compass, and 6 days of rations. The total load was about 220 kilograms, and with this weight, they would paddle 70 miles through enemy waters at night. Crazy? Absolutely. Brave? Without question. But this was war, and sometimes the impossible had to be done. And they did it. On September 21, 1942, Hasler presented the operation plan. 6 canoes, 12 men. They would be transported to the French coast by submarine, deployed at the Gironde estuary, and paddle for 5 nights to reach Bordeaux. During the day, they would hide along the riverbanks. At night, they would advance. Once they reached the target, they would attach limpet mines to German cargo ships and then escape overland to Spain. Spain was a neutral country, and from there they could make their way to Gibraltar and eventually back to England. A 100-mile escape march through enemy-occupied territory, hoping for help from the French resistance. The plan was insane, but it made sense. Lord Louis Mountbatten, head of Combined Operations, reviewed the plan. Initially, he opposed Hasler participating in the operation personally. Hasler was too valuable to lose. But Hasler insisted. This was his plan, his men, his responsibility. Eventually, Mountbatten relented. The operation was approved. Codename Frankton. November 30, 1942, Scotland, Holy Loch Naval Base. The submarine HMS Tuna, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Dick Rakes, quietly slipped out of port. Inside were 12 Royal Marines and 1 reserve soldier. 6 canoes had been carefully stowed on deck. Each canoe had a code name, all named after sea creatures. Catfish for Major Hassler and Marine Bill Sparks, Crayfish for Corporal Albert Laver and Marine William Mills, Conger for Sergeant Samuel Wallace and Marine Robert Awert, Cuttlefish for Lieutenant John McKinnon and Marine James Conway, Coalfish for Corporal George Sheard and Marine David Moffett, and Cachalot for Marines Fisher and Ellery. 13 men, 6 canoes, 1 target. For 7 days the submarine crossed the Bay of Biscay. The men were crammed into tight spaces, waiting. They replayed everything they had done during training in their minds. Hassler had spoken to his men. He had told them plainly the chances of not returning from this mission were high. Each one had accepted it. Bill Sparks, Hassler's canoe partner, had a special motivation. His brother Benny had lost his life when HMS Naiad was sunk. Sparks had volunteered to avenge his brother. That was why he sought out dangerous missions. He had joined the Royal Marines at 17, a working-class kid from London's East End, but there was fire inside him. December 7, 1942, 7:30 p.m., approximately 15 kilometers off the French coast. HMS Tuna surfaced. The sea had swelled, with waves reaching 5 meters. The wind was fierce. Conditions were far from ideal, but the operation would not be postponed. On deck, the canoes were prepared. The submarine's gun was used as an improvised crane to lower the canoes into the water. The first disaster came immediately. While lifting the cachalot canoe from the casing, it struck a deck fitting. A 45-centimeter tear ripped through the canvas hull. It couldn't be repaired. Fisher and Ellery couldn't participate in the operation. They remained on the submarine along with reserve soldier Coley. 12 men had become 10. 5 canoes were lowered into the dark waters. The waves were fierce, but the men remembered their training. They closed their spray covers and began paddling. Hassler was in the lead. Catfish guided the convoy toward the Gironde estuary. But the night had only just begun. And they would suffer more losses. This is where we end the first part. In the second part, I'll cover in detail the tragic losses the 5 canoes suffered while trying to reach Bordeaux, the operation itself, and Hitler's infamous commando order. If this story interested you, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because part 2 is going to be even more intense. If you're curious about the second part, stay tuned because we're moving right into it. Welcome back to part 2, everyone. We're continuing our story without slowing down. 5 canoes, 10 men, pitch darkness. The raging waters of the Gironde estuary tossed the small canoes from side to side. Waves crashed over their heads, ice-cold water splashing against their faces. In December, the Atlantic waters were below 10 degrees Celsius. If you fell into these waters, you had 15 minutes before hypothermia killed you. Hassler was in front. He was trying to keep the bow of the Catfish canoe pointed into the waves. Behind him, 4 more canoes struggled not to lose each other in the darkness. The tidal current was incredibly strong. The men were paddling but seemed to be standing still. Muscles burned, breath ran short. That's when the first tragedy struck. At the most violent point of the tidal current, the Coalfish canoe capsized. Sergeant George Sheard and Marine David Moffett fell into the freezing waters. The canoe had overturned, their equipment scattered. They were thrashing in the darkness. When Hassler noticed the situation, he turned back. He stopped the convoy and they began searching for Coalfish. But the darkness was too thick. The waves were too high. Voices were lost in the wind. They couldn't find them. Hassler had to make a difficult decision. Waiting any longer would jeopardize the entire operation. They needed to reach the shore before dawn. Otherwise, German patrol aircraft could spot them. With a heavy heart, he gave the order, "Continue." 4 canoes continued into the darkness, leaving 2 men behind. Sheard and Moffat didn't drown, at least not immediately. They managed to reach the shore in the darkness, but the freezing waters had already taken hold of their bodies. Hypothermia is a silent killer. First, the shivering starts, then the shivering stops. That's a bad sign. As body temperature drops, consciousness fades, and eventually the heart stops. On December 14th, Moffat's body was found on Ile de Ré. Sheard's body washed ashore elsewhere, probably further north. 2 young men. They had lost their lives before the operation had even truly begun. The score? 8 remained out of 10. But the losses weren't over. When the convoy encountered a second tidal race, they lost sight of the Conger canoe. Sergeant Samuel Wallace and Marine Robert Ewart had suddenly vanished into the darkness. Hassler searched again, but it was useless. They couldn't find Conger. Now 3 canoes remained: catfish, crayfish, and cuttlefish. 6 men. Wallace and Ewart were actually still alive. They had lost the convoy but hadn't capsized their canoe. They tried to continue on their own through the dangerous waters of the estuary, but their luck didn't hold. At some point they were forced to come ashore, and there they were captured by the Germans. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video for this dangerous mission. This is where the story takes a much darker turn, because Wallace and Ewart would not be treated as ordinary prisoners of war. They would be treated very differently. We'll come back to that shortly. 3 canoes managed to reach shore before dawn. Near Saint-Didier-de-Médoc, on the western bank of the river, they found a sandy beach. They pulled their canoes onto land, covered them with camouflage sheets, and hid among the bushes. 6 men, exhausted, wet, freezing, but alive. Hassler assessed the situation. They had started with 10 men, 6 remained. They had lost 4 men. 2 were probably dead, 2 were missing. But the mission continued. The plan was clear: hide during the day, paddle at night. Bordeaux was still about 55 miles away. They needed to hold on for 4 more nights. That day they waited silently among the bushes. Occasionally German patrol aircraft passed overhead. Once they heard the voices of nearby fishermen. They didn't move. They held their breath. As the sun set, they moved again. The second night the convoy covered 25 miles. It was an excellent distance, but not enough. They still had a long way to go. They hid near Saint-Estèphe. They waited for the next night. The third night was even harder. The tidal currents were working against them. Progress was slow, muscles burning. Meanwhile, the local population was beginning to notice them. At one point, while hiding on the shore, fishermen spotted them. Hassler thought quickly. He told his men not to draw their weapons. Instead, he approached the fishermen and spoke in French. "We are English," he said. "Please don't tell anyone." The fishermen nodded. "Bonne chance. Good luck." Most of the French people hated the German occupation. Helping British soldiers was a small act of resistance for them. If those fishermen had talked, 6 men would have died there. They didn't talk. But not everyone would be so lucky. The night of December 10th to 11th. 3 canoes entered the Garonne River. Bordeaux was now close. Just 1 more night. But that night, disaster struck the cuttlefish canoe. Lieutenant John McKinnon and Marine James Conway were advancing with the convoy, but at some point their canoe was damaged. Maybe they hit a rock. Maybe the tidal current tore the hull. The details aren't clear. The result was that Cuttlefish was no longer usable. Hassler had one option: take McKinnon and Conway into his own canoe and continue together. But this wasn't practical. The canoes were already heavy and designed for 2 people. They couldn't carry 4. A difficult decision was made. McKinnon and Conway would stay on land and try to reach Spain on their own. The escape plan already anticipated this. Captured or separated teams would go to the town of Ruffec and try to make contact with the French resistance there. The two groups wished each other good luck and parted ways. McKinnon and Conway came ashore. They buried their canoe and started walking. But what awaited them was not freedom, but captivity. Now 2 canoes remained, Catfish and Crayfish, 4 men, and finally the target was within range. The night of December 11th. Hasler and Sparks in Catfish, Corporal Laver and Marine Mills in Crayfish. 4 men reached the edge of Bordeaux Harbor. For 5 nights they had paddled a total of 70 miles through freezing waters in enemy territory, feeling death's breath on their necks. But the job wasn't done yet. The most dangerous part was about to begin. During daylight hours, they found one last hiding spot. They concealed their canoes and waited. Hasler checked the mines and equipment. Everything was ready. The plan was this. After midnight, the 2 canoes would enter the harbor separately. Catfish would target the western quay, Crayfish the eastern quay. They would attach the limpet mines below the waterline of the ships and then withdraw silently. At 9 p.m., they moved out. The sky was clear, the moon hadn't set yet, and this was dangerous. Visibility was too good. But they couldn't wait any longer. They had calculated the tidal currents and couldn't miss this window. Catfish and Crayfish advanced silently through the dark waters. Hasler and Sparks approached the western quay. Giant shadows emerged in the darkness, German cargo ships, giants moored at the quay, lying silent. Their first target was a Speerbrecher, a mine-clearing vessel. Hasler brought their canoe alongside the ship. Sparks lowered the limpet mine into the water. The magnetic mine attached itself to the ship's steel hull. Then they moved on to the next ship, Dresden, Tannenfels, Portland, Alabama. One by one they approached the ships and placed their mines. At one point they were nearly caught. There was a guard on the Speerbrecher's deck. The man looked toward the water. He turned on his flashlight and pointed the beam at the canoe. Hasler and Sparks held their breath. They didn't move. The camouflaged canoe looked like a log in the dark water. Seconds passed like hours. Then the guard turned off the flashlight and turned away. Maybe he thought he saw a log. Maybe his eyes deceived him. Whatever the reason, Hasler and Sparks had survived. They placed a total of 8 mines on 4 different ships. Meanwhile, on the other side of the river, Laver and Mills were carrying out their own mission. The Crayfish team initially couldn't find targets at the eastern quay. The ships weren't where they expected, but they didn't give up. They drifted a little further downstream and found 2 large cargo ships at the Bossains quay. 8 more mines, 5 on a large cargo ship, 3 on a smaller vessel. By 12:45 a.m., both teams had completed their mission. 16 mines, 6 ships. Now it was time to escape. The 2 canoes withdrew down the river with the tidal current. By coincidence, Catfish and Crayfish met at Ile de Cazaux. They found each other in the darkness, a brief greeting, a final farewell. Hasler wished Laver and Mills good luck. From here on, everyone was on their own. Near Saint-Genès-de-Blé, both teams came ashore. They tried to sink their canoes. The evidence had to be destroyed. But the canoes wouldn't sink easily. Eventually, they buried them and set off. Laver and Mills headed south, while Hasler and Sparks headed northeast. The destination was the same, the town of Ruffec, the rendezvous point with the French resistance. From there to Spain, from there to Gibraltar, and finally home. But between them lay 100 miles walk, enemy patrols, and the possibility of betrayal. The morning of December 12th, 7 a.m., the first mine exploded in Bordeaux harbor, then another and another. Chaos erupted in the harbor. German soldiers were running, sirens were wailing, smoke was rising. The damage report was as follows. Tonnenfels suffered heavy damage, listed and sank. Dresden had her stern and propeller shaft blown off, settled on the bottom. Alabama was riddled with 5 mines, heavily damaged. Portland suffered serious internal fire damage. 2 more ships sustained various degrees of damage. 6 ships, some sank, some heavily damaged. Bordeaux harbor was paralyzed. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe right away and like the video. Let's continue. The Germans were in shock. How had this happened? The harbor was supposed to be secure. 32 patrol boats guarded the river. How could the enemy infiltrate this deep? When a German officer examined one of the captured canoes, he was furious. How can this child's kayak pass through all our defenses and travel 70 miles? He shouted. The answer was simple: courage, training, and determination. But for the Germans, this answer wasn't enough. Someone would pay for this. This is where the story takes a truly dark turn. On October 18, 1942, about 2 months before Operation Frankton, Adolf Hitler had issued a directive called the Commando Order, or Kommandbefehl. This order explicitly stated, from now on, all men operating against German forces in so-called commando raids in Europe or Africa are to be destroyed to the last man. This holds whether they are in uniform or not, armed or unarmed, in combat or attempting to escape. Whether they arrive by parachute, ship, or aircraft makes no difference. Even if these individuals clearly indicate a willingness to surrender, no quarter is to be given under any circumstances. This was completely against the conventions of war. Uniformed soldiers, no prisoner of war rights, direct execution. This was a clear violation of the Geneva Convention. It was a war crime, but Hitler didn't care. At Nuremberg, this order was recognized as a war crime, and German officers who implemented it were convicted. But in 1942, for captured commandos, it was a death sentence. And the heroes of Operation Frankton would become victims of this order. Now let's look at what happened to the lost men. Wallace and Ewart, the Conger team, were captured by the Germans after the first night. They were interrogated. Whether they were tortured is unknown, but in accordance with the commando order, they were executed. On the night of December 11th, they were shot in a sandpit in a forest near Bordeaux. Dresden had her stern and propeller shaft blown off, settled on the bottom. Alabama was riddled with 5 mines, heavily damaged. Portland suffered serious internal fire damage. 2 more ships sustained various degrees of damage. 6 ships, some sank, some heavily damaged. Bordeaux harbor was paralyzed. Now let's look at what happened to the lost men. McKinnon and Conway, the cuttlefish team, tried to reach Spain overland after losing their canoe. But they were captured. They too were held under the commando order. They were taken to Paris and executed on March 23, 1943. Laver and Mills, the crayfish team, had one of the most tragic stories. They had successfully placed their mines. They had completed their mission. On their escape route near Montlieu-la-Garde, they were captured by French gendarmes. This is where betrayal enters the picture. Some French officials handed the British soldiers over to the Germans. Vichy France was a puppet government collaborating with Nazi Germany, and some officials took this collaboration seriously. Laver and Mills were handed over to the Germans. They were interrogated, and they too were executed under the commando order. 6 men. 4 had been lost or captured on the first night. 2 were captured after the mission. All of them were killed. Only Hassler and Sparks remained. 2 men, in enemy territory. They needed to walk hundreds of kilometers. German search teams were behind them, and ahead of them, the most difficult part of the survival struggle was about to begin. After setting out from Saint-Jean-de-Blé, Hassler and Sparks walked at night and hid during the day. They avoided approaching villages. Their food was scarce. The weather was cold. The French countryside was unforgiving in December. Muddy roads, freezing winds, constant rain. Once they spent the night in a railway hut, a place full of rats, cold and damp, but at least there was a dry roof. As the days passed, their physical condition worsened. Their shoes were worn out. Their uniforms weren't civilian clothes and attracted attention. In every village, on every farm, there was a risk of capture. But Hassler was determined. He would avenge his men. He would return home, and he would tell this story. 6 days later, on December 18th, they reached the town of Ruffec. Ruffec was a small French town, but a cell of the French resistance operated here. Hassler had been told before the operation, "Go to Ruffec, you'll find help there." But there was a problem. The signal that was supposed to be sent from England hadn't arrived. The resistance members were unaware that 2 British soldiers were coming. Hassler and Sparks walked through the town carefully. Who could they trust? Any stranger could be a threat. Finally, they entered the Hôtel de la Toque Blanche. It was a gamble, and their luck held. The hotel owner connected them with one of the leaders of the French resistance, Mary Lindell. Mary Lindell was an extraordinary woman. Of English origin, she had served as a nurse in World War I. In World War II, she was organizing escape lines in France. She was smuggling Allied pilots, escaped soldiers, and agents to Spain. Lindell took Hassler and Sparks to a farm, the farm of Armand de Breuil. They would hide here. They stayed at that farm for 18 days. They waited. They rested. They tended their wounds. Meanwhile, Lindell traveled to Switzerland and informed the British embassy. 2 commandos had been rescued and were waiting to be sent home. In mid-January 1943, the escape began. Hassler and Sparks set off southward with guides. The destination, crossing into Spain over the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees were the mountain range between France and Spain. Crossing in winter was dangerous. Snow, ice, cliffs, but it was the only safe route. They walked for days, sometimes by vehicle, sometimes by train, most often on foot. Finally, one night, they crossed the mountains and set foot on Spanish soil. Spain was a neutral country. Officially, they were safe, but Spain's Franco government leaned toward Germany. Captured Allied soldiers were sometimes arrested, sometimes deported. Hassler and Sparks had to be careful. They reached the British consulate in Barcelona. From there, they were sent to Gibraltar. Hassler flew back to England. On April 1, 1943, he set foot on British soil, approximately 4 months later. Sparks was sent by sea, but there was a problem. In Gibraltar, no one could verify his story. The Cockleshell Heroes operation was highly classified. No one knew who Sparks was. The result? He was arrested. Quite a strange situation, isn't it? Bill Sparks was brought to England not as a hero, but as a suspect. Military police escorted him to London. At Euston Station, Sparks gave the police the slip and escaped. Why? Because he wanted to see his father. His father thought his son was missing. The official record said, "Missing in action." Sparks went home. He knocked on the door. His father opened it. Imagine that moment. The son thought to be dead, standing at the door, alive, safe. 2 days later, Sparks turned himself in at the Admiralty. They wanted to arrest him again, but this time Sparks escaped to Combined Operations Headquarters. At headquarters, they recognized him. shock and joy together. One of the last two survivors of the Cockleshell heroes had come home. Hassler was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Sparks received the Distinguished Service Medal. And what about the others? At that time, the DSM couldn't be awarded posthumously, so Laver and Mills were only mentioned in dispatches, meaning they were commended in official records. 6 men had been executed, 2 had died of hypothermia, and only 2 had survived. Winston Churchill said this about Operation Frankton: "This operation may have shortened the war by 6 months." 6 months. Perhaps an exaggerated claim, perhaps not. The real effect of the operation was more psychological than physical. The Germans had realized that no harbor was safe. The British had proven that even the most impossible-seeming missions could be accomplished. The importance of morale in war can never be underestimated. Lord Mountbatten, the head of Combined Operations, said the following about the operation: "Of the many brave and daring raids carried out by Combined Operations Command, none was more courageous or ingenious." These words are carved on a stone at the Special Boat Service headquarters at Royal Marines Pool. They still stand there today because the Cockleshell heroes aren't just a war story, they are a legend. This is the end of Part 2. In the third and final part, I'll cover the post-war lives of Hassler and Sparks, the legacy of the operation, the 1955 film, and why this story is still worth telling today. I'll also give you a small hint about the next video, because there are many more stories to tell on this channel. If you've watched this far, you're a true history enthusiast. Keep going. Part 3 is waiting for you. If you want to know how this story ends, subscribe right now and like the video. We're moving on to the final part. Welcome to the final part. The war was over. The guns fell silent. The dark clouds over Europe dispersed. But the story of the Cockleshell heroes didn't end. In fact, the real story was just beginning. Because some stories aren't written on battlefields, but afterward. How heroes are remembered matters just as much as what they did. And these men, they refused to be forgotten. When Germany surrendered in 1945, the Allies began investigating Nazi war crimes. The fate of the 6 Royal Marines executed during Operation Frankton became part of these investigations. Remember, Wallace, Ewart, McKinnon, Conway, Laver, and Mills. 6 men, all were uniformed soldiers, all should have had prisoner of war rights, but they were shot because of Hitler's commando order. At Nuremberg, the commando order was explicitly recognized as a war crime. The officers who issued and implemented it were tried. Admiral Erich Raeder was the head of the German Navy. Under cross-examination, he admitted transmitting the commando order to the Kriegsmarine and ordering the execution of the Royal Marines at Bordeaux. In his defense, Raeder claimed the order was justified and the executions were not war crimes. The court disagreed. Raeder was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was released in 1955 and died in 1960. But this didn't bring back the men who died. Bill Sparks attended the war crimes trials as a witness. He watched his friends' killers be tried. Justice had been served, but the pain was still fresh. What did Hassler do after the war? Guess what? He returned to the sea. He retired from the Royal Marines in 1948, but a quiet retirement wasn't waiting for him. Hassler wasn't the kind of man to live an ordinary life. The innovative ideas he developed during the war continued in peacetime. Canoe designs, sailing technologies, nautical equipment. Hassler was constantly inventing something. His most important invention was an automatic steering system called the Hassler wind vane. This system made solo ocean crossings possible. Sailors no longer had to stay awake for days holding the helm. In 1960, Hassler participated in the first single-handed transatlantic race, which he himself had proposed. From Plymouth to New York, alone, in the middle of the ocean. He came in second, but he was the real winner, because this race was the beginning of modern ocean racing. Hassler's character was interesting. He hated the nickname Cockleshell Hero. He didn't like heroism stories. He was a modest man. He once said, "Sailors who cause trouble should drown like gentlemen." A harsh statement, but it summed up Hassler's philosophy. Take care of yourself, don't complain, survive or die with dignity. He spent the last years of his life in Scotland. He worked on organic farming. He embarked on strange adventures like searching for the Loch Ness Monster. On May 5, 1987, he died at the age of 73. The madman of the sea had finally found peace. Bill Sparks's story was different. Hassler was an officer from an educated and wealthy family. Sparks was a working-class kid from London's East End. After the war, Sparks returned to an ordinary life. He became a bus driver, then a bus inspector. Think about it. A hero of one of the world's bravest operations was driving buses on the streets of London. But Sparks didn't complain. He continued with his life. He got married. He had children. In the 1950s, he served as a police lieutenant in Malaya, now Malaysia. During what was called the Malayan Emergency, he fought against communist guerrillas. The man couldn't sit still. In 1955, his life changed. Warwick Films decided to bring Operation Frankton to the big screen. The Cockleshell Heroes was directed by Jose Ferrer. Ferrer also played the role of Hassler. Bill Sparks was played by a young actor named Anthony Newley. The film was a huge box office success in Britain. It became one of the most watched films of 1956. Sparks worked as the technical advisor for the film. He made sure the details were accurate. He fought against Hollywood's exaggerations. After the film came out, Sparks went on a promotional tour in America. He posed for photos with American sailors in Baltimore. For a moment, he was famous, but fame was fleeting. Sparks returned to London and continued as a bus inspector. In the 1980s, Sparks's life became difficult. As a war veteran, he received a disability pension, but this pension was cut. A bureaucratic decision, a calculation on paper. Sparks needed money, and he had only one valuable thing to sell: his medals. What a painful situation, isn't it? 8 medals, including the Distinguished Service Medal, the tangible evidence of the Cockleshell Heroes operation. There were arguments within the family. Some were against the sale, but Sparks had made his decision. The medals were put on sale at Sotheby's auction house. They sold for £31,000. The buyer remained anonymous. Years later, it was revealed that the buyer was Lord Ashcroft. Ashcroft was a businessman with the world's largest collection of Victoria Crosses and gallantry medals. And Ashcroft did something unexpected. He put the medals in Sotheby's vault and gave instructions. Bill Sparks could wear these medals whenever he wanted. Sparks had lost his medals but hadn't lost his honor. When he attended ceremonies, he wore his medals. No one knew the difference. In 1983, 61-year-old Bill Sparks did something incredible. On the 41st anniversary of Operation Frankton, he repeated that journey. Together with Jerry Lockyer from the Imperial War Museum, he paddled 70 miles from the Gironde estuary to Bordeaux. The same waters, the same distance, but this time there was no enemy. Sparks had made this journey to raise money for cancer research. He later said, "It wasn't as dangerous as in 1942, but we knew the tidal currents back then. Paddling was much harder this time." A 71-year-old man was following in the footsteps of his youth. He was honoring his friends. He had never forgotten them. Today, the Cockleshell Heroes are commemorated in many places. In England, memorial ceremonies are held every year at the Royal Marines Memorial Gardens in Portsmouth. Near Canoe Lake in Southsea, where the training bases were located, there is a plaque. A statue was erected in Stockport for James Conway. In France, annual memorial ceremonies are held in Bordeaux, Blanquefort, Saint-Georges-de-Didon, and Ruffec. In 2011, a memorial was erected from Portland stone. It honors both the Cockleshell heroes and the 3 French people who helped them. In Blanquefort, a tram stop is named Frankton. The Frankton Trail was opened in 2002. It's a hiking route that follows the 160-kilometer escape route that Hasler and Sparks walked in France. Today, those who walk this route follow in the footsteps of those 2 men. They feel history with every step. Would you like to walk this route? You can write in the comments. December 1, 2002, Bill Sparks passed away at the age of 80. The last Cockleshell hero was gone. He left behind a wife, a daughter, and 3 sons. One of his sons, Terry Sparks, became a captain in the Royal Marines. He carried on his father's legacy. Sparks's funeral was held with military honors. He was buried in Alfriston, East Sussex. But his spirit still lives on, in those canoes, in those dark waters, among those brave men. How successful was Operation Frankton from a military standpoint? To be honest, the physical damage was limited. 6 ships were damaged, but all were eventually repaired. The harbor was operational again within a few weeks. But the real impact was psychological. For the Germans, the message was clear. Nowhere is safe. Even the most protected harbors are vulnerable to attack. For the British, it was a morale victory. 1942 was one of the darkest years of the war. The Germans were advancing on every front. Britain was weary and worn. The Cockleshell heroes gave hope. They said, "We can strike too." They said, "We can win too." Churchill's claim that it shortened the war by 6 months may be exaggerated, but the strategic importance of the operation cannot be denied. Furthermore, the RMBPD later formed the foundation of the Special Boat Service. Today, the SBS is one of the world's most elite special forces, and its roots trace back to those dark nights when those 12 men paddled. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Why did I tell this story? Why did I give so much detail? Why do these men matter? The answer is simple. Because courage is universal. The Cockleshell heroes aren't just a British story. They're a story of how far the human spirit can go. 10 men volunteered for an impossible mission. They knew they wouldn't come back. They went anyway. 8 died. 2 returned. But none of them gave up. None of them ran. None of them abandoned their friends. This happened in 1942, but it's still relevant today. It will be relevant tomorrow. Courage is timeless. Let me end with Lord Mountbatten's words. Of the many brave and daring raids carried out by Combined Operations Command, none was more courageous or ingenious than Operation Frankton. These words are carved in stone, but what truly endures is the story of those men. Hasler, Sparks, Laver, Mills, Wallace, Eller, Cairns, McKinnon, Conway, Sheard, Moffat, Fisher, Ellery, Coley. 13 names, 13 lives, 1 legend, and legends never die. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next video. Thank you for listening to this story. Next time, I'll be back with another forgotten tale of heroism. Which story would you like me to tell? Write it in the comments. Take care of yourselves until the next video. Goodbye.